So we began yesterday the issue of Yotze, of Psul Yotze, with regard to Kodshim Mizbeach, and we said that Yotze has to do with a concept called Yotza Chutz Mimchitzasa. And it's derived from the parasha of Treifa. And there's a pasuk that says, Hein lo huva es dama el hakodesh pnima. That has to do with the whole story with Moshe after the death of Nadav Avihu and the Chatos and so forth. But in any event, it was Yotza Chutz Mimchitzasa, and with the Psul of Yotze, it requires Streifa. Makom ha'achila shel kodshei kodshim hanechol. So in order to appreciate Yotze, you have to set up the boundaries for each one of the karbanos. So let's start with kodshei kodshim. And that would include chatas and asham. It would not include ola, because ola is completely kolil and there's no discussion about achila at all. How about kivsei atzeres? So first of all, kodshei kodshim in general has to be eaten in the Azara. And now we have kivsei atzeres, right? Those are the kvasim that will accompany the shtei alechem on atzeres, on Chag HaShavuos. And although they would seem to be shlomim, but the Torah upgraded them to the status of kodshei kodshim. And therefore, you cannot eat them b'chol ha'ir, anywhere in the city of Yerushalayim. You can only eat the basar of the kivsei atzeres within the confines of the Azara, like kodshei kodshim. Now, in addition to the Azara, we have an entire sugya called l'shakos. And there were various chambers that were built in the Azara. And you could go in there and eat basar. And the l'shakos have the status of Azara. So you can eat the basar of kodshei kodshim in the l'shakos. However, what we need is suchos la'azar. We have to make sure that the l'shakos have an entranceway and can be accessed through the azar. Then they are an extension of the azar. If on the other hand they open up into chol, into area that's not sanctified, it's not the azara, then even though it's built in the azar, but the opening entranceway is through chol. You can only get there through the chol and not through the azara. Then the l'shakos have the status of chutz l'azara. You cannot eat kodshei kodshim there. So we're talking about l'shakos ha'psuchos la'azara. Now, what happens in a case where it's impossible to eat the basar in the Azara for whatever reason? To go out of the Azara, that's impossible. That's not even a havamim. Or what could be possible is to go from the Azara, upgrade into the Heichal. B'makom she'yefshel lechel ba'Azara, efshel lechel ba'Heichal. So in that sense, it means from the Azara and up. You upgrade to the Heichal. And you can eat the basar of kodshei kodshim if necessary inside the Heichal. That's a sugya in Zvach Madaf Samach Gimel. As far as l'shakos are concerned, in contrast to eating in the Heichal, where eating in the Heichal was only a fallback position if absolutely necessary, not so in the case of l'shakos. If the l'shakos open up into the Azara, they have their entranceway into the Azara, then even l'chatchila, you're allowed to eat kodshei kodshim there. Now, what about shlomim? Shlomim can be eaten anywhere in the city of Yerushalayim. So therefore, the psul of Yotze would only apply if the basar shlom was taken out of the boundaries of Yerushalayim. And this halacha of kodshei palim applies not just to shlomim, but also to toda, to el nazir, to bechar, maser, and pesach. We have 5 categories besides shlomim itself of karbanos, which essentially are like shlomim. And the proof is the measuring rod, the moded, that it's kodshei palim, is the fact that you can eat the basar anywhere in Yerushalayim. Not so in the case of Kivsei Atzeres, which with regard to the mechitza of achila have the status of kodshim. They could only be eaten in the azor. Now, just thinking out loud, I mean, Shlomim, Toda, El Nozir, those are not so common. But Pesach is annual. And if the boss of the Pesach has to be eaten within Yerushalayim, then for sure you're going to want to rent a place in Yerushalayim. Do you follow me? In order to be the mitzvah of Achilas HaPesach. If you take it out of Yerushalayim, it's possible midin yotze. So it pays to buy real estate in Yerushalayim, it seems. I mean, you can open up a really good business, a rental business. I don't know if it's Airbnb or whatever, you can rent out your place. I mean, all of Eretz Yisrael are converging on Yerushalayim. Truth be told, I would think that forget about Korban Pesach as a mitzvah achilas HaPesach, just talk about any Korban Shlom. There's halacha of lina that you're required to stay overnight in Yerushalayim. That itself would make it a very viable rental business. If you had a place in Yerushalayim to rent out to anyone who's bringing a korban, any korban. So people from all of Yerushalayim are coming to the Beis Hamikdash to bring their korbanos, and they have to stay overnight in Yerushalayim. Gagin Valios. I know my Rebbe has a lot of Torah on Gagin Valios, but I wouldn't want you to test me on it. It's in a book called Chidushei Agram V'Agrid Al Inyonei Kodshim, and it's the product of a long-standing chavrusa for years between a father and a son, between Moshe and his son Rabbi Yoshe, and they produced from the notebooks an entire sefer on Kodshim. He says that Gagin, meaning the Lishakos, have the status of the Azor, but not the Gagin. The rooftops do not have the status of the Azor. You need the Ritzvah's Azor or the Ritzvah of the chambers that open up into or from the Azor. Then we have something called Aliyos, which means they built a second story on top of the Gag. So you have a Gag, and it's only a one-story chamber. You're not allowed to eat Kodshim on the Gag. Now, they built a second floor on top of the Gag. So for sure you can't eat Kodshim on the Gag of the second floor. But can you eat Kodshim inside the chamber? And the answer is no. Because those are called aliyos, and they're not endowed with the sanctity of Azor, status of Azor. And this, I believe, is a machlokes in the Gemara Psochim, whether aliyos, veligagin, aliyos niskachu, or lo niskachu. We're assuming that lo niskachu, they don't have the sanctity of the Azor. Then he says, Eina ochlim kodshim kalin, the Gagin Valios Shal Yerushalayim. Now let's ask a different question. With regard to Kodshim Kalim, we're allowed to eat them anywhere in Yerushalayim. However, just like we said about Kedushas HaZorah, we have an issue whether or not the Kedushas HaZorah includes the Gagin Valios. And we came to the conclusion that in fact it does. That it does not. So too, Gagin Valis of Yerushalayim were not included in the Kedusha of Yerushalayim. And that's going to be relevant to Achilas Kodshei Kalim, which have to be eaten within Yerushalayim, within the Kedusha area of Yerushalayim, and the Gagin Valis lo niskadosh. I'm wondering if the same halacha would apply to Ma'aser Sheni. I assume yes. Ma'aser Sheni has to be eaten in Yerushalayim as well, even though it's not a zeva, but it has Kedushas Ma'aser Sheni. Can you eat Ma'aser Sheni and Gagos V'Aliyos of Yerushalayim? I would assume not. By the way, in the footnote, he does have one Tosfos that seems to indicate that Gage Yerushalayim Ki Yerushalayim. So the rooftops of homes in Yerushalayim were sanctified with Kedushas Yerushalayim for Achilas Kodshim Kalam. Nechleku Rishonim im din zeh shegagim v'aliyos lo niskadshu lo nemar el begagim shekvar hoyu b'shas kiddush hazorah o af begagim shenivnu li'achar kiddush. So this is very fascinating. He's now offering a sheet in Rishonim that when they made the original Kiddush of the Azara, which I'm not sure if that happened during David HaMelech's time or only during Shlomo HaMelech's time. Let's assume Shlomo, right? He built the Mikdash, and now there was a process of sanctifying the Azara. They decided that they would sanctify the Ritzvahs Azara, but not the Gagos V'Aliyos. And that's called Gagos V'Aliyos Lo Niskadsh. So the Kedushas Azara did not extend to include the rooftops and the second story. But let's say they built the second story or the Gag after the original Kiddush. And there's one school of thought in the Rishonim that in such a case, they would build it with the intention of sanctifying it with the Kedushas Azara. So when we say that Gag and V'Aliyos Lo Niskadoshin, that means they were not included in the original Kiddush of the Azara. Not that they're excluded from Kiddush. There's no reason in the world why Gag and Aliyah should not be or cannot be sanctified. They can be sanctified. But in the case of the original Kiddush HaZorah, the decision was made to leave out the Gagin and the Aliyos. But now, if somebody comes along and builds Gagin V'Aliyos, then we can assume they would sanctify with Kedushas HaZorah. Umikol makom Gagin V'Aliyos shahoyu b'shas Kiddush v'nersu kadosh ha'avir b'makom zeh. I don't understand. Gagin V'Aliyos shahoyu b'shas Kiddush. We just finished saying Lonis Kadoshim. Kadosh Ha'avir Li'ach Nersu. Something's missing here. I don't know. You have any clue why this Kiddush Ha'avir here? I mean, if the Gagin V'Aliyos Lonis Kadoshim, why should the Avir be Mekudosh?
And does that just mean if you're inside, but you aren't on
Correct.
the floor,
You're suspended in midair.
or you're sitting on a chair and your feet up, reach the floor.
Maybe, I don't know, you have to know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so,
Well, let's take a dramatic case.
yeah,
You're floating through the air above the ground, and you're eating kodshim. And he's saying that even if you're in the airspace that was occupied in the past by an aliyah or a gag, but since they're not there anymore, it's still considered the avir of the azar. In other words, when the physical space was there, then there's no avir and lonis kadosh. But that's only because the physical gag or the aliyah is taking up the avir. Once you remove the gag or the aliyah, then you have the avir, and the avir of the azar is this kadosh. But again, he's assuming that if you're floating through the space of the airspace of the azara, holding on to the pulka of kodshim, you're allowed to eat it. That's a premise which I'd love to investigate whether.
And is that similar? I mean, Tuma goes up.
Yeah, very good. I was thinking the same. Like Tuma Ritzutza, if you have a corpse and there's no space of a tefah covering it, then the Tuma breaks through and goes all the way to the Shemayim. We have a similar idea called Godachis Mechitza, Godasik Mechitza. That Mechitzas continue up to Shemayim. This is the issue of Kohanim, on airplanes because they go over cemeteries. But I'm just thinking, if let's say you took an airplane over the Azara, would you be allowed to eat kodshim? But only if you jump out of the plane with a parachute, because otherwise the airplane itself would be a hefsek for the oven. And you're not in the oven. But if you're a tzamchan, and you're parachuting out of a plane, holding on to a piece of basar kodshim, and you're over the airspace of the Azara, maybe you'd be allowed to eat the basar. H Misha Kosa, one top left, Chekodje Kodshim Anecholim Bazara, Akoin Liros Pesach HaHechol B'Shas HaKila. Now this reminds me of Parah Adumah. Where does he come off saying such a thing? Once again, he doesn't fill in the pieces of the puzzle. Why should there be such a halacha of tzarech liros Pesach HaHechol? But one conclusion I derive here is that Kedushas Azara is really an extension of the Heichal itself. I mean, on a lower level, the Kedusha of the Heichal is very intense, and it sort of spreads out into the Azara in a diminished way. It's not the same intensity. But that's where the Kedushas Azara emanates from the Kedusha of the Heichal. Because inside the Heichal, we'll be able to get to the Kodesh Kadosh. And really, the Azar itself is the Azar of the Mikdash. It's almost the outer courtyard of the Mikdash. So the Kedusha of Mikdash bursts through and spreads throughout the Azar. And therefore, if you're eating kodshim, we want you to be connected to the Heichal. Because the Heichal is the source and the root of the Kedusha Azar. And we had a similar idea in Parah Adumah. And even though the Parah Adumah is outside the Mikdash, you have to be able to see through the Pesach HaHeichal. Also, did we have something similar with regard to Hazas Hadamim? You remember perhaps that there were two ways of getting from the Heichal into the Kodesh Kadosh. There was one paroches on the north side, another one on the south side. Yeah, I mean, there even in terms of Bein Abadim, we have a concept of you're doing the Zrikas Adam here or Hazos Adam, but yet it relates to an area that's at a distance because you're watching the Bein Abadim. I don't know. But this is an interesting concept in the world of Kodshim, that you could have something called Roeh. I think I heard once from my Rebbe that when Moshe Rabbeinu wanted to enter into Eretz Yisrael, HaKadosh Baruch Hu refused, but he said to him, Alei Rosh HaPizga, and saw No'inecha Ure'eh, that Moshe Rabbeinu was able to see Eretz Yisrael from a high point. And my Rebbe said that means he was Makadesh Eretz Yisrael with Re'iyah, that sight itself is an agent of Kiddush. Mechitzas Psul Yotze. So until now, we've been speaking about the basa. Now he wants to talk about the dam. And likewise, the dam itself cannot go outside of the azara. So that's the mechitza of dam. If the dam was taken out of the azara before the zrika, then there's no possibility of zrika because the dam became possible with yotze. Imurim ubasar kodesh kadoshim sheyatzu chutz lazara nifsulu biyotze. So not only is there psul yotze vis-a-vis achilas adam, that's the basar that we eat. In this case, the kohanim will eat it. But even as far as the imurim are concerned, which is haktaras achilas mizbeach, there's a psul of yotze. Basar ve'imuri kodshim kalim jiyotzu kodem zrikas dama nechluku b'gemara im nifslu b'tziyasam chutz lazar, meaning normally yotze in kodshim kalim is out of Yerushalayim. But if we're talking about before zrika, and zrika is necessary to be matir the basar, so before zrika, the confines of the dam and the basar is going to be the azara. It's only after zrika, then we expand the bounds, I should say, to include all of Yerushalayim. Now he has a long footnote here. Let's just see. Do we want to do this footnote? It says, Tamas Sovich Botsa Kodshim Kalim Kodem Zrika Lo Nifsal B'Yotze, a Lo Nifsal B'Yotze. 1 second. We're talking about a Yotze Chutz Le'Azara. Nechleku B'Gemara. We've been discussing that. Mandiyamu holds there is a Psul Yotze as far as Hazar is concerned with the Basar and the Dam of Shlomim, Kodshim Kalim. Before Zrika, and then the confines and the boundaries are identical to Kodshim, meaning in the Azara, but there's one man who says no. He says, Lo nifsal biyot. Mishum shesofo lotzes. Interesting. Even though it's before Zrika, there's no matir, but nevertheless, what's going to be after Zrika? We're going to take it out of the Azara and eat it anywhere in Yerushalayim. So this is called li'achar Zrika, sofo lotzes. So we analyze the boundaries, the mechitzos of basar kodshim kalim, not by the befal, the actual boundaries, but by the bakach, where we're going down the line after Zrika. And we're going anywhere in Yerushalayim.
Did we say before, that you could eat it before the Zrika?
No, I think if you eat it before Zrika, it's me'ilah. But the question of psul yotze depends upon the mechitzos. And you would say the mechitza of the azara would certainly be relevant before Zrika because it's not yet mutar b'achila. There's no heter, neither for the Mizbeach nor for the achilas hakohen. But there's a new halacha, a new mechanics, a principle of sofo lotzes. So even though now, in actuality, the mechitz is really the azara for Zrika, nevertheless, since potentially we could be matir the boss through Zrika and expand the mechitzas to include all Yerushalayim, therefore there's no psul yotze if the dam was removed from the azara. So Yishtana Machitza Me'azor Yerushalayim. Once the Zrika will take place, the Machitza now expands to include all Yerushalayim. Uleficha kam kodem Zrikim before Zrika, Shadaim lo hutar abasar, nikba Mechitzasa lazar. Wait a second. What does this mean? Nikba, there's a mistake over here. Should say Nikba Machitza Yerushalayim. It's a toast fuss over here. Cross out the word Azara and put in the word Yerushalayim. V'tam asover shenifsal biyotze, mishum shadayin lo igia zman olotzes. Right now, before there is no Yerushalayim. There's no achila at all. Ainu kodem azrika she'ein habasa mutar b'achila. Im kein mechitzaso achshav hi hazor. Okay. That proves to me that there was a mistake in the print before, because he's repeating the same thing twice. Mechitza lazar for two different shita. That's interesting. In other words, when you talk about the basa that's nechal, either l'bailim or l'kohanim, then you can talk about expanding the mechitza after Zrika to include all of Yerushalayim. But that doesn't apply to the basar of the emurim that's designated for achilas mizbeach. I mean, there's no way, no how that you can take them out of the azara. I mean, you have to put them on the mizbeach. He says, "Mishum shekodshim kalam mechitzasam Yerushalayim." Kodem Zrika hem adayin Kodshim kalam. V'rakli achar Zrika nasim Kodshim. In other words, it's really fascinating. The emurim changed their status through Zrika from Kodshim Kalim to Kodshim. The emurim of Kodshim Kalim, I'm going to say this very extreme and then I'll backtrack it, have the status of Kodshim. Could you imagine? The Zevach itself, it's Shlom, it's Kodshim Kalim. But the emurim are Kodshim. And then Afkamina is going to be if you take the emurim of Shlomim out of the Azar. And it all depends upon Kodem Zrika and Liachar Zrika. Liachar Zrika, there's nothing to do with this emurim other than to put them on the Mizbeach and burn them with Aktaras emurim. And therefore, we're confined to the Azara. And if you take the emurim after Zrika, outside of the Azara, and again, we talk about the emurim of Kodshim Kalim, they become possible in Yotze. But as far as the Emurim before Zrika is concerned, so there's no Achilas Mizbeach right now, then we view the Emurim as like part of the whole animal, part of the whole Zevach, without a separate identity of its own. And it's Kodshim Kalim. And there's no psul of Yotze to take it out of the Azor. So I wouldn't go as far as to say that Kodshim, that Emurim, in other words, what is the halachic category or status of a Murim of Kodshim Kalim? If you ask me, I would say it's Kodshim Kalim. But the problem is that after Zrika, what do you do with these Emurim? Where's the Mechitza? The Mechitza means where's the Kiyum Mitzvaso? The Kiyum Mitzvaso it'll only be on the Mizbeach. So you can yell and scream from the rooftops that this is Kodshim Kalim. But what do you mean? Kodshim Kalim means that you eat it anywhere in Yerushalayim. That's not true for the Emurim. The Emurim have to be burnt on the Mizbeach. So the status of Kodshim is not, that's a misnomer. You can't call it Kodshim. It's a shlamim. It's not an olam. I mean, it's not a chatas. But if you ask me what the mechitza is, the dim mechitza of the emurim is equal to kodshim. That's just its din as far as the emurim are concerned. As far as the mechitza is concerned, it's a halacha mechitza. The mechitza of the emurim after zrika is the azor. So let's see where we got up to now. I think we're up to a paragraph that starts Korban Pesach. Am I right? Or do we not finish this? 1 second. Maybe there's just a little bit more. A muri kodshim kalim liachar zrika. Oh, here's my proof. You say I should have read the next line. The emurim of kodshim kalim after zrika, and if solim v'yitziasam chutz lazara, not because they kodshim, I mean, but because zoe v'chitzasam laktara. What is the mitzvah you do with emurim if not burn it on the mizbeach? And therefore the mechitza becomes the azara. Also, kodshim kalim liachar zrika nifsal and yotza michutz liyushalayim shezoy mechitzas achilasa. Yeah, now he's not talking about the emurim; he's talking about the bus. So the bus is nechal lebailim, for example, not just the kohanim. Give the bailim part of the basar to eat, and the mechitza is all of Yerushalayim, so that the psul of Yotzei would only be if you took it outside Yerushalayim. Very good. Now I feel a little bit more secure in what I was talking before. Okay.